Happy Halloween, everyone, and welcome back to Spiritman Studios. And this is my 1,000 subscriber special slash Halloween episode, I guess. This was originally going to be a Halloween episode, but I figure why not take the opportunity and tell you guys thank you so much for 1,000 subscribers. It's been a hell of a trip, and let's get into the topic of the video. So we all have those childhood trauma type movies, you know, the movies like Dark Crystal or the original Pennywise from It 1990, the miniseries. And while those are but light potatoes to a person like me, I think, for me personally, my childhood trauma is A Nightmare on Elm Street. Back in the day when there were things like video rental stores who were on the brink of bankruptcy, me and my dad would go down to the local Hollywood Video, which is a video rental store we had. We didn't have Blockbuster. We didn't have Family Video. We didn't have those things. We had Hollywood Video. It was a nice little thing. And every year around Halloween, we would have some sort of scary movie to watch on Halloween. And I had seen things like Pet Sematary, and I had seen things like Stephen King's It. And, you know, while I was scared of clowns after seeing Stephen King's It, and I was scared of zombie cats after seeing Pet Sematary, they were kind of light potatoes, because I knew that those things didn't really exist. I knew that things like an ancient creature who could shapeshift into a clown isn't necessarily real, and then zombie cats obviously are not that real. So I figured, you know what, let's try something else scary. And my dad's like, are you sure you want something really scary? And I'm like, sure, why not? And so we go down to Hollywood Video and we pick out the original Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984. And it was on VHS at the time. They didn't have a lot of DVDs and whatnot. And we went to go get some pizza. We get our traditional thing together. And we watched it. And at first, I watched it all the way through without being scared, because I was 6 at the time and I didn't really know much. But then I go to sleep that night, and that's where the terror really begins. And for me, that was where I found myself in a sort of locked sort of continuum with the original Nightmare on Elm Street film. And for years after that, every time I would see a cover or even a picture of Freddy Krueger in any of his incarnations, I would just be like, nah. You know, I would go to things like Salvation Army, and then they would have like VHS tapes of Nightmare on Elm Street. I would just flip it over to its backside so I didn't have to look at Freddy Krueger's face. It was that emotionally just targeting to me. And I think the reason why, really, was that at the time, I was being bullied at school, and I felt like the only real safe place for me was at home, in bed, and asleep. But you get something like this, you get something like Freddy Krueger, a character who can basically manipulate your dreams and pretty much kill you in your sleep, was enough for me to say, nope, I'm not sleeping anymore. And that is one of the reasons why I think Nightmare on Elm Street is one of those films that has continued to stay with me even until recently. I think it's one of my favorite horror films of all time. Is it perfect? No, I think some of the characters are a little bit cut and paste. I think in terms of the concept of, you know, a character who embodies, you know, death inside of your dreams, death inside of your, you know, sleep, is already terrifying. And if it wasn't terrifying enough, you know, researching this film years later after I watched it, I had found out that the film was basically based off of something that happened in true life. Now, granted, Freddy Krueger wasn't real, but there was a person who was living years ago, this little kid, who kept having nightmares about a guy who would chase him all the time. And he had coffee pots in his room and whatnot. And essentially, what happened was he tried telling his parents about it, and they wouldn't listen. They would just say, oh, you're just having a bad dream. You're just having a bad dream. And he died because he kept staying up all the time. That in of itself is scary. right? That in of itself is scary. The fact that it's still based off of something that happened in real life just brings a whole new level of realism to the piece of Nightmare on Elm Street. And looking at the film years later, there are other things I think what makes it so unique in its sense. Back in the 70s and 80s, there were tons of slasher villains, even up through the 90s. We don't get a lot of new slashers nowadays, but back in the 70s and 80s, you had a whole slew of them. You had Jason Voorhees, you had Michael Myers, you had just tons of slashers. I mean, you could just take a look at something like In Search of Darkness and pretty much get all you need to know about slashers in the 80s. But what makes Freddy Krueger unique is not only his power set, but also the fact that he is one of the only horror villains, other than, Chucky of the 80s, right, who could actually talk. Because you look at something like The Shape, or you look at something like, Jason Voorhees, they don't talk. They rarely talk at all. And yeah, they're imposing and they're menacing, but I think the scariest part about Freddy Krueger is that he can manipulate your emotions inside of your dreams and just basically kill you based off of your flights of fantasy or even just anything he wants, really. I think another thing that makes this movie very unique is the sort of disconnect between reality and the dreams and the cohesive editing that comes with it. I take the bathtub scene, for example, is one of the best examples, because here you have Nancy Thompson who's laying in a tub, and you start to see, Freddy's glove come out between her legs and going up towards her. And it's one of those images that is evocative, it's provocative, and it's very terrifying, for one thing, but it also highlights that she's dreaming then, but then you hear her knock at the door, and the cloud goes back down as if he's somehow in the real world, but he's not necessarily there. I think the key to that scene is that there is not necessarily a distinction between what's real and what isn't. In that scene, in of itself, you could make the case that Nancy is sleeping, and her hearing the knocking and the mother telling her not to go to sleep is something that she's hearing while she's sleeping in the bathtub. And it doesn't actually show you that. And I think that's part of the way that scene works so well, because the editing of that scene is just seamless. It doesn't need to cut back to reality. Part of the scare is not being able to know what is dreams and what is reality. And that's the unique thing that's one of the unique things I feel is special about the original 1984 film. Something that the remake just doesn't understand. I don't want to talk about the remake. It's garbage. It's hot garbage. No. If you want an actual in-depth video about Nightmare on Elm Street, the remake, I definitely would actually recommend the Stitched Together Productions video, Boots to Reboots, Nightmare on Elm Street remake. That is a really good video about the comparison between the original and the remake, and it's also much more entertaining than what I could really do here. Hi, Future Nick here. I didn't get a chance to talk about performances because A, the camera died, and B, I don't have another battery on hand, so let's talk about it. So Heather Langenkamp plays Nancy Thompson, and I feel like she's pretty much the grounding of the film in terms of our relation to the nightmares she is having. She's a character that has gone on to be in things like Nightmare on Elm Street 3 and Nightmare on Elm Street New Nightmare, or Wes Craven's New Nightmare, rather. Nancy Thompson has always been kind of a figurehead woman of the franchise, and for good reason, because she's resourceful, even towards the third act where she tries to ambush Freddy Krueger. She is very resourceful in the fact that she read up on how to do these sort of traps. It's a very strong female character in that sense. And from the beginning of the movie, we assume that we're following Tina because, well, she starts off the film, and kind of like in Psycho, she dies halfway through the movie. Tina! And that's kind of where the break comes in, and we get the new character perspective. And of course, this review wouldn't go without saying, but this is the first introduction of Johnny Depp as a movie actor. And the only reason why he was chosen for the role was because Wes Craven's daughter liked him. That's pretty much it. But the glue that holds this movie as well as the rest of the franchise together, no matter if the movie was bad or weird or even great, is Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger. He is the sole bond of this whole franchise, especially of this movie. He's menacing, he's creepy, he lurks in the shadows. There are several shots in this film where he's just menacing. He's peering behind pipes, he's moving his arms and hands, and his mannerisms are just that of a very impy-like demon. It's scary to think about this guy a lot, especially when we're given a backstory of him just killing kids. And it's especially disturbing because of his mannerisms with the claw glove and his whole speaking pattern, really. And of course, as the series went on, he became less and less menacing and more jokey, making all of his kills in later films just feel more like punchlines than anything else. Kind of like a Final Destination movie sequel.
Out of here now, Tracy, now!
Hey, you forgot the power glove!
You're just waiting for people to die, and then he's gonna make a joke, and all that fun stuff. But in the original, he's just really menacing, and if we only had that film, I think he would still be remembered for that film only because of his actions in the film. But with Nightmare on Elm Street, there's just something special about it that I really love. And part of it is the editing, but it's also the cinematography, the way the lighting is in this film. Makes it feel like, there isn't necessarily a distinction between what is the real world and of the dream world, other than the fact that in the dream world, it's kind of nighttime all the time. And that makes sense, because most of the kids sleep during the night. Except for Nancy Thompson, who sleeps in class, and there's that whole daytime scene. Oh yeah, by the way, in that scene, in the high school dream scene, the teacher is played by Lynn Shay, who you would know from the Insidious movies. She is one of the best horror actresses I've seen ever, so props to her. I'm really glad she was in this film too, because that's something I've noticed recently when I watched it. It's like, oh, that's Lynn Shay. It's pretty cool. Now, obviously, I'm not going to talk about the sequels in this video, because that's a whole different topic all of its own, but I think the original 1984 Nightmare on Elm Street is one of my favorite horror films, and I said it before, and I'll say it again, it is one of my favorites. Not only because of its editing and cinematography, but also the fact that they do a lot of inventive stuff with it. There's a lot of iconic imagery that you could pull from this film. You have, of course, the image of Tina being lifted in the air, being rolled around on the ceiling, which was a really cool effect of, flipping the set upside down and just rotating the set while the actor who played Robbie is just sitting there, buckled with his hair just kind of glued to his head. I thought that was really cool. And then you have, Johnny Depp being pulled into his bed, and then this blood fountain just comes out of the bed. And of course, one of the wackier ones is Freddy Krueger outstretching his arms, and it's just this long arms. But the most iconic image is the one where Freddy Krueger just peers through the wall, and that was done practically with this weird sort of fabric thing, and he had someone just go like that and then come back in. I thought that was really amazing at the time, and even up to this day, and it still holds up. Now, obviously, this film has a very odd ending. The ending being that once Nancy Thompson somewhat defeats Freddy Krueger, takes back her power, somehow Freddy Krueger manages to get the upper hand and takes Nancy and all the other people away in a car that he has, and the mother is still killed. Now, if this was a self-contained story, this would be a much more devastating ending, because it would appear that Nancy Thompson had failed, but knowing that we have 8 movies ahead of us, or at least 7 movies ahead of us after this film, you know that he actually didn't really win in this one, because Nancy Thompson comes back in not one, but two of the movies. Now, granted, you can make the case of New Nightmare not necessarily being a Nancy Thompson story and more of a breaking the fourth wall meta-narrative film about Nancy Thompson, but that's a whole different can of beans. But she does come back in Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, so yeah, the ending doesn't really make much sense in this movie. And that's something I found in retrospect. As a kid, I found it still terrifying, and the fact that, you know, there's still more of these kind of frightened me as a kid too. So yeah, all in all, I think Wes Craven, in terms of, you know, I think Wes Craven is a master of horror, and this was one of my favorites of his. Sure, he did The Hills Have Eyes and The Last House on the Left and tons of other films, including Scream, which I'll talk about next time, sometime soon, I don't know. But I think, you know, A Nightmare on Elm Street definitely revolutionized the way we look at horror movies, or slasher movies in general, because at the time you had things like Jason Voorhees and Michael Myers, who just kind of like killed because it's entertaining. Here, there's much more of a sympathetic backstory to the character himself. The character's given more screen time, he has a lot more to say for himself, and his power set is much more intriguing to me personally than someone like Jason Voorhees or Michael Myers or even Chucky. I think personally Freddy Krueger is my favorite horror slasher villain. And so in conclusion, A Nightmare on Elm Street, while it isn't necessarily the most perfect movie out of the entire franchise, because we all know that's Nightmare on Elm Street 3, this movie is one of the best I've seen. It's one of the best slashers I've seen. It's one of my favorites. It still holds a place in my heart, and that's all you can really say about it. I'm going to give Nightmare on Elm Street 1984 a B. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of my video on Nightmare on Elm Street. It's a little bit rushed together, mostly because, well, I have other things to do, because tonight I'm seeing Terminator Dark Fate, and I'm not quite excited for it, so here's to good luck, I guess. Yeah, if you like what I do, like and subscribe. Comment down below what your favorite Nightmare on Elm Street kill is, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.